Intersections of culture and health. Starting out with the intersection of culture and health. In this PowerPoint, I will be discussing some of the interconnected pieces of both culture and health. So over the last year, there have been myriad changes in our world, a global pandemic, political unrest, and a much needed lens pointed squarely at not only social inequalities, but health disparities. These inequities and disparities have been shown to negatively affect health outcomes in greater numbers of those in marginalized and minority populations. There are a number of factors that play into what creates health outcomes. How culture intersects with determinants of health is just one of them. Some of the models of health and healthcare include the biomedical, which is an understanding and explanation from a purely scientific perspective. The biopsychosocial uses the lens of both biology and psychology to understand health and disease. The wellness model combines spirituality and quality of life to the understanding of health. And social ecological. So the social ecological model of health includes aspects of all the other models in addition to an understanding of how culture plays an important role. So for now, keep in mind that there isn't just one influence of greater importance. Culture and health are complex, and I don't mean to simplify one or the other. Remembering about the social determinants of health, which include the environment in which people exist, affecting health outcomes, with pertinent aspects being access to healthcare services, social support, social norms and attitudes, and including culture. In a previous PowerPoint, I discussed some of the theories that relate to the interconnectedness socially. This is really focusing on health. When we talk about culture, this influences how a person interprets and experiences the world in which they live. It is many things, including how one generation shares and passes down food traditions, language, religion, and social behavior, which is an important understanding of how to survive and adapt. So ideas around what makes up culture can vary from viewpoint to viewpoint. The influences on culture, we need to take into consideration all the ways that people are exposed to other cultures intentionally and unintentionally. So the first piece is really about colonization, and this is defined as the action or process of settling among and establishing control or domination over the indigenous people of the area. So domination by a foreign group has happened all over the world for thousands of years. Some obvious and more recent events include, and by recent I mean in the last 100 years, which is a drop in the bucket when we consider the thousands of years that people have inhabited the planet Earth. So Europeans to North America and Australia, where indigenous people had lived for thousands of years, yet we still speak about Columbus discovering America. The French sent prisoners to penal colonies in Australia and other islands in that part of the world. The Spanish to Mexico, Central and South America. The conquistadors traveled from Spain to Mexico into the Americas, enslaving the indigenous people there. There is also forced migration, which is bringing a group from their home country for the purpose of cheap labor, often in the form of indentured servitude or slavery. Just some overly simplified examples would include Africans brought to North America, Chinese brought to North America, as well as South America, Europeans sent to prison colonies in Australia, Northern Europeans traveling to North America to get away from religious or political persecution, or prison sentences, or even famine or war. People moving from their homeland in search of safety, security, peace, and freedom, keeping in mind how all of this affects the cultures of everyone that is involved. I want to take a moment to speak about appropriation. This is just another way to look at how culture is changed or viewed. So appropriation is defined as using another's culture as if it were your own. There is respectfully exploring or studying another culture without taking it on as if it were your own. You can pay homage without exploitation. There are things like archaeological digs. So examples of this are the removal of artifacts from Egyptian tombs to be displayed in museums without the consent of those it belonged to, or like digging up Indian burial grounds without regard to the significance or of the location. Style of dress, or other mannerisms, acting or dressing or speaking in a way because it's trendy, can be an act of disrespect and cultural appropriation. So really, what's the problem with this? The problem is the disregard for something that another holds sacred or cherished. Imagine what it would be like for you to have something you hold close to your heart used as a joke. A fabulous quote by Bell Hooks, who was an activist. She states that appropriation is in and of itself isn't automatically negative. What is detrimental is what is done with what has been appropriated. So me, as a white woman whose ancestors came mostly from Northern Europe, cooking traditional Indian food is not appropriation, but me dressing up in a sari for Halloween would be. To bring this back to the topic of health, the dominant culture in the United States historically holds the notion that the European way of seeing and functioning in the world is the true and correct way. North Americans have a long-standing anthropological understanding of which culture is the pinnacle, and this view has affected how healthcare and health policy was and is created. This stance has embedded disparities in the decision-making and delivery process of healthcare across generations. Anthropology has been used historically in an attempt to define and decide medical evidence about how disease and illness affected groups of people positively and negatively, using cultural and racial differences as proof. Culture is an ethnological issue whereby capabilities and habits are obtained. So this sentiment, along with earlier evidence from the 18th century, shows the medical knowledge base as one that divides healthcare according to race. These beliefs and sentiments continue to this day and have shown up in disparities around the pandemic due to the novel coronavirus, or as we know it, COVID-19. Raina Hogarth has written a book called Medicalizing Blackness, where she explores the root cause of many medical beliefs about diseases that were at one time ascribed to variations in skin color. Many of these notions still hold true today and affect diagnosis in some subtle and not so subtle ways. Cultural differences include varying ways that racial and ethnic groups think differently about health and illness. For example, a major difference between Eastern and Western ideas of health and healing is illustrated when looking at something like traditional Chinese medicine or TCM. Western cultures tend to view the body as a machine consisting of parts to be diagnosed or repaired when breakdown occurs, which is part of the Cartesian dichotomization of the body and mind, so in Western ways of thinking about disease. In Eastern cultures, mind and body are treated as an inseparable balancing act of positive and negative energies. In this Eastern modality, like TCM, there is the interconnectedness between all of nature expressed in something that's called the 5-element theory. So each of these elements, water, food, fire, earth, and metal, has a yin or feminine dark internal expression and a yang masculine light external expression. They have organ pairs that has a season, a color, emotion, and a whole host of other aspects. So this for me is an explanation of why Chinese people or Asian people that follow and practice traditional Chinese medicine are more likely to express somatic symptoms when Westerners would speak in ways that are more aligned with biology or something like a chemical imbalance in the brain when it comes to mental health issues. Many ethnic groups hold cultural or philosophical underpinnings in the diagnosis and treatment of conditions. Differences in treatment is determined by the unique display of symptoms based on assessment findings with an attempt to balance the energies as a way to relieve whatever distress may be present. It is a more broad systems approach. In Western medicine, the tendency is to find the one issue that is causing the problem, then treat that, which often sets off a whole host of side effects, especially when we start adding in a bunch of different medications. From a cultural perspective, it also seems relevant to look at the expressions of culture and mental illness on the individualistic collectivist spectrum, as was discussed in a previous PowerPoint. The shaping of and notion that personality is part of the mind-body state is important in understanding the more collectivist way of viewing the world and the individual. With the increasing awareness of culture as more than just a set of beliefs, it is seen as dictated by superstition. It is important to change the view that has led to the dismissal of many ethnic groups' experiences in healthcare. So lifespan developments, how we have been treated affects us directly during our lifetime, but also affected by how our ancestors have been treated. In the same way that culture is passed down, so are ways of managing health. So health and culture truly begins at home. The food we eat, the behaviors that we display, the earliest learnings of how we interact socially all begin at home. This also includes how we take care of our health and how we manage stress as we grow and develop. Stress is not always or automatically bad, but that would be the subject for another time. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll just assume that stress is not good. So the processes, in the simplest explanation, stress causes inflammation, which is an accumulation of blood and lymph cells, either systematically or locally, in response to something like a direct injury or an infection. The immune system is made up of organs and cells that carry genetic material which respond to environmental stressors like a pathogen. So this is a disease-causing microorganism. When a pathogen enters the body through the respiratory system, as in COVID-19, there is an increase in pulmonary inflammation and mucus secretions, making breathing difficult. So this is known. What has not been known is why some people get very sick and die and others remain relatively asymptomatic. Many want to blame a person's race or gender or ethnicity for their increased susceptibility towards contracting certain diseases. When we talk about health outcomes, these can be attributed to a variety of factors. For example, many people would like to blame African Americans' lack of trust as a predominant factor in poor health outcomes or health disparities. However, negative health perceptions may be attributed more to treatment or management by providers than patient perception alone. The experiences in the African American community have proven to them and others that many parts of the medical community and the federal government cannot be trusted. Due to the treatment and experiences that many in the African American and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities have had, there is reason to understand the mistrust. Early development is about the developing years. We learn how to navigate life through examples set by our primary caregivers and others that make up our familial environment. How we take care of ourselves is part of that learning. What foods we eat, when we seek medical attention, etc. When we are raised in an environment that fails to support individuals, communities, and cultures, we suffer the consequences of neglect. People's health suffers. We learn what constitutes aspects of our culture, including ways to function in society, and even that what our place is in that society based on our experience and the experience passed down through narratives, those things that we hear. The United States has a history of racial divides that include policies and laws that essentially taught Black people their value was less than that of whites. The COVID-19 deaths. The studies have revealed the disproportionate burden of COVID-19 deaths among some racial and ethnic minority groups, with selected states and cities of data on COVID-19 deaths by race and ethnicity show that 34% of deaths were among Black people, though this group accounts for only 12% of the total U.S. population. This is according to the Centers for Disease Control in 2020. During this pandemic, the number of who is being vaccinated and who is being treated versus who is is dying shows the present disparity. Some of those current events, we talk about chronic inflammation. So this is an understanding that a failure to address chronic inflammation plays a key role in the severity of complications from systemic illnesses, from things like COVID-19, for example. Addressing these issues is a matter not only of immediate healthcare concerns, but those that create long-standing chronic conditions that can leave a person susceptible to something like COVID-19. So things like diabetes, heart disease, and even mental health issues. So the data shows that there is an increased risk of contracting COVID-19 virus in people with chronic health conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease. Because certain communities have been marginalized, misunderstood, and often vilified throughout history, there are policies and procedures in place that create barriers to adequate health care of many chronic health conditions. So COVID-19 is responsible for a pandemic. So no one community, group, or population is spared. Lockdowns, face masks, ventilators, and vaccines are part of the world's quote-unquote new normal. In those marginalized communities, they've been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, socially, economically, and in terms of health outcomes. On the upside, the attention of the widespread devastation has brought greater awareness and understanding to what has been happening in marginalized and minority communities and groups around the world for decades. COVID-19 has provided the opportunity to see and address social equity issues for exploration of health disparities. When light is shown on how some populations are underserved and underrepresented, then understanding and change can begin. Social support deserts are places that lack the social supports necessary to kind of catch people when there are chronic health issues or even acute health issues. So according to the article by Peak in 2021, place matters when considering numbers affected by illnesses, things like COVID-19, with the highest percentage of death happening in cities and counties with higher numbers of African Americans. In many of these communities, there are social support deserts, which are defined by having limited access to quality food stores, education disparities, and decreased access to health care. But individual risk matters, as well as the fact that all African Americans are affected in varying degrees to economic and socio-political burdens associated with racism. When people are not able to access quality nutrition, healthcare, education, or social supports, their health suffers, just like anyone's would. Some consequences are widespread and often baked into systems. One thing to remember is that when people get sick and remain sick or die, the effects run deeper than just the person and their immediate family. By ignoring the impact, or even blaming the person or the community or the person's culture for their problems, instead of looking through a broader lens, we will continue to get the same results we've always gotten. Failure to recognize keeps us stuck, and when we begin to acknowledge the connection between how we've been treated and how we treat others, then we can begin to work for the necessary change, for real change, assuming that everyone is on the same page when it comes to access to healthy foods or a livable wage is dismissive of the larger issues affecting us all. This continues marginalization. When we fail to see the interconnectedness of everything and everyone, we risk repeating the same mistakes, which ultimately keeps marginalized people marginalized. We fail to address the health issues that can be bettered through simple changes in education, healthcare, and social policies. Disparities, the lack of affordable health insurance, limited availability of affordable housing, food insecurity are just some of the chronic social issues that affect all of us in one way or another. According to the 2018 U.S. Census, 10.6% of African Americans and 16.1% of Hispanics were uninsured, compared to 5.9% of non-Hispanic whites and 7.3% of Asian Americans. Nearly 14% of African Americans and 10% of Hispanics reported having fair or poor health outcomes, compared to just over 8% of non-Hispanic whites. 8.7% of African Americans and 8.8% of Hispanic adults received mental health services, compared to 18.6% of non-Hispanic whites and 6.3% of Asian Americans. And some of the leading causes of death in the African American community and among Hispanics is heart disease, accidents, and cancer. In addition, African Americans have the highest mortality rate for all cancers combined compared to any other racial or ethnic group. So these and many other statistics for all racial and ethnic groups can be found at www.americanprogress.org. Some specific recommendations. So improved healthcare resources. Not only is there a need for improved healthcare, but care that falls into the realm of mental health. Psychological factors such as social contact, social determinants of health affect outcome, with personal relevance such as meaning and belief being a determining factor in both mental and physical health outcomes. With the minority population experiencing high death rates from preventable illnesses, there's also a greater need for assistance in managing and dealing with the after effects. Increased awareness, there's a need for this on how negative health outcomes affect everyone, not just members of a specific group. So addressing all facets of health, from the earliest health interventions for pre and perinatal health care to education around maintenance of chronic health conditions, or better yet, how to avoid them in the first place. Education, access, and social supports for both physical and mental health needs will improve the standard of living in the United States and all around the world immediately and into the future. And here are your references.